So our speaker tonight is Ed Warner. He spent over 20 years working in environmental conservancy. I think that's how you say the word. Conservation. Conservation is the proper term. He is here tonight to tell us about free market solutions to environmental problems. So give it up, Ed Warner.
Thanks. I got to left-handed. I do everything backwards. I have to apologize for not showing up, at Liberty on the Rocks. I mean, this is really a lot of fun. But I try to hide most of the time because I'm doing public lectures a lot, and so you need a lot of private time to kind of rehabilitate yourself from the experience. I'm an eccentric, and I recommend this to everybody. If people think you're an eccentric, you can get away with anything. I say the most outrageous things to the most famous and important people, and they actually like it. I get away with it. I started my career in geology. I was an oil and gas geologist. I was the enemy of the environment. The environmental movement began in the 1850s with John Muir, who was a Calvinist. And if you know anything about the history of Calvinism, it was a brutal, nasty religion that beat the shit out of its children and advocated that God gave the earth to humans to do anything they damn well pleased with it. We had dominion over nature. And the consequence was that we ate everything, we destroyed everything, and we had to learn that there were limits to our excesses. The Sierra Club is a direct output of John Muir, who said, man is the enemy of wilderness. And by the way, the forests that John Muir was studying in California were not actually wilderness. They had been managed by humans for thousands and thousands of years. He was a great scientist, but he didn't recognize it. It's an aspect of science. You learn as you go along. Over 100 years later, Aldo Leopold came along. He worked for the Forest Service. He recognized the forests that he was managing, in this case in Arizona, had been managed by the Anasazi and the Navajo and other tribes, and they were not natural environments. Aldo Leopold believed in the marketplace and private lands being stewards of the land, because if they were stewards of the land, their economic prosperity would grow. So there was a market-based understanding of what it meant to do a better job, not only on your farm or on your ranch or in your timberlands for making more money, but if you treated the environment in a healthier way, you would end up making more money as well. So here I am, an oil and gas geologist. I go out and I have to supervise drilling rigs, which are really dangerous places. And so naturally in my backpack was my Peterson bird book and my Audubon flower book and my Rocky Mountain book on trees. Nobody carries that. I like trees. And I started going and hiking across the countryside. And if you're in Wyoming or Montana or Utah, you cross private lands. And if you go up to a ranch house, this would have been 1960s and 70s, and you said, hi, I'd like to go and take a walk or take a drive across your land, they were very friendly, and they said, just leave the gates the way you found them. And then something changed in the late 70s and early 80s. And I was going up to ranch steads, and they were saying, you don't work for the government, do you? No, I'm a private individual geologist. Oh, okay. Do we have any oil and gas potential on our land? Is there a way we can make money? What do you want to do today? Well, I thought I would look at the rocks and maybe I would, hunt arrowheads, or maybe take my flower book out and look at the prairie flowers. And they said, oh, well, would you like coffee in the morning? And on a ranch, coffee is at dawn. It's at 5:30 in the morning, right? Because these people work really hard. I fell in love with private landowners as stewards of the land. They were being demonized by the Sierra Club and the environmental movement. They were evil. You know what's going on in this country right now? This is tribalism. It is us versus them all over the place. It is the evolutionary pathway that's no longer working for us, right? When we evolved on the savannas of Africa, you didn't know anybody that didn't live around your fire, your little village, your 50 people. Every single tribe has a name for themselves. I've worked all over the world in things like conservation, not just geology now. And the word for those people, right, for the Shoshone or the Maasai in Africa, is either the people or the human beings. And if you are the people or the human beings, you can get to kill everybody else because they're non-human. That's what we're doing to ourselves. So I can tell you that all of my friends in oil and gas will not give a penny to the environmental movement. Basically, fuck you, you know, you've called us the enemy, you've demonized us. We don't like it, right? But I'm a contrarian, I can't help myself. I'm always looking to prove people wrong. God forbid you say something's impossible, and I will struggle to find a way to make it possible. That was my success in life, thinking outside the box. And so as a lecturer across the country in colleges, honest to God, I flunked out of college my first time around, and yet I'm a visiting lecturer at MIT. You can actually accomplish this, you know? I mean, life is adaptive, and we can do this. And I talk about these principles to environmental studies students who are being taught that the world is coming to an end, the enemy is humanity. And so one of my talks is entitled 3 Positive Aspects of Climate Change. You do notice that you've never read anything good about climate change? Is there anything in the world that is totally negative? Come on. There's the yin and the yang to economics, to culture. Everything in the world has some winners and losers. So I came up with 3 winners, you know, and I present that because kids actually don't want to be pessimistic. They don't want to start their careers thinking that they have no hope. That's a terrible thing to do to young people. And so I got involved in the Aldo Leopold private lands, protecting private property rights, public-private partnership type of problem solving using science. Science, data comes first. And so the old environmental movement was characterized brilliantly. In 2005, I was at a conservation meeting at Texas Wild, the Dallas-Fort Worth Zoo in Texas. So Texas joined the Union as a republic. And there are 3 things critical to Texans that they got in their negotiations with the Congress. Number 1 is the Lone Star flag flies at the same height as Old Glory. The only state that's allowed to do that. You go look at in front of the public buildings, right? U.S. flag is higher than the Colorado flag. Number 2, they get to divide into 5 states if they ever want to. Now, they never will, they don't want to. But under the law, they can have a referendum and divide into 5 states. Number 3 was the really important one. Every single territory from the 1850s on, negotiating to become a state, had to give up the rights to all their unoccupied lands. That's why we have 50% federal and state lands in Colorado. That's why Nevada has 90%, only 10% of the land was under the Homestead Act and other acquisitions. The 1872 Mining Act that perfected the land rights. And everything else is the government. Texas negotiated that all their Indian lands be returned to the state of Texas. That's why Texas manages their land so well, and they're so bloody rich. All that oil and gas royalties goes into education funds and other, really valuable social contracts. And Texas is absolutely one of the greatest places to do private lands conservation. And one of the reasons it is that the federal agencies under some of our environmental laws, like NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, and ESA, the Endangered Species Act, demand that the regulations that come out of those laws are done by federal agencies ESA is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Agency. They had to come up with regulations to figure out what constituted a threatened or endangered species, how they would approach that. And it is a disaster. It defies the Constitution. It gives power to the feds over the states and over private lands. And it leads to this concept of good intentions leading to bad things. So I'm at Texas Wild, and in Texas, those government scientists have to work with private landowners. So, and they have to say, please may I. You know, they can't just use appropriation, they can't use eminent domain. They have, if they buy lands, they have to pay full price, they have to negotiate with private landowners. Landowners do not have to sell to the federal government in Texas under any condition. And so, Fred Krupp, who runs Environmental Defense Fund, you can boo and hiss now, gets up there in front of the Secretary of Interior, the Governor of Texas, a whole bunch of senators and Congress people, government scientists and agency people and private landowners, and lots of rich people whose names you might recognize, who are both great big landowners, ranchers, and oil and gas people with lots and lots of money. And Fred Krupp says something that changed my life. He said, the first 25 years of Environmental Defense Fund, our motto was sue the bastards. So I like that because you're not allowed to swear in public, but I can, in my lectures, I can say sue the bastards because that's a quote from a famous person. He said, we had to learn the law of unintended negative consequences. What we discovered was while we were suing people, the money was going to lawyers, it was sticking in the courts, and the important environmental issues weren't getting done. We realized that there was a totally different way to approach this, and it's the approach of Aldo Leopold, the Sand County Foundation. See that little patch on me? I'm actually wearing one of their shirts. I'm a director for 20 years now, which is market-based solutions, incentives for things that are common to us. So I've gotten up in front of 800 businessmen and explained ecosystem services payments. And I guarantee you, if I was an academic ecologist, I would now explain ecosystem services payments and you wouldn't understand a fucking thing I said. They hide behind their jargon. So here's how it works. So this is a quiz. Somebody's gonna have to answer this question. And Leif Smith's an old friend of mine. He knows that all of my questions are trick questions. So, first question is, what does a rancher grow?
Gold, money, nothing. The land grows it. Does not grow any cattle.
Who said grass? Give her a free beer. Yeah. Give him a free beer. Come on, grass. Ranchers do not grow cattle, they grow grass. Right? Their great-grandfathers overgrazed the range, killed the perennial grasses, and went broke. That's not a really good business model. And so if you interviewed ranchers around the West, you would find they have degrees in animal husbandry and management, in rangeland management, in grassland ecology. These are really educated people, and they are now imitating nature. They are ecological ranchers and farmers. So get over it. They are not the enemies of the land. They're actually the stewards of the land. So, let's say that we live in the city. How many people here have ever seen a sage grouse? No, not on nature. I mean in reality. Tromping across the bloody prairie. One person, two people. Nobody knows what a fucking sage grouse looks like. I was a field geologist, so I went out there and shot them and barbecued them. You know, so let's say that 99% of the voters, those are the people living in the cities, think that sage grouse protection is more important than raising cattle. You can sue the bastards, put them out of business, destroy their livelihoods. Now the land is lying empty, and who's going to manage it? The government? The government sucks at management. Private landowners love their land. They're much better managers of the land. So instead of suing them and putting them out of business, Why not incentivize them? So if you think sage grouse are more valuable than cattle, why don't you pay them to steward the sagebrush steppe and grow more sage grouse? That's what we want. Why don't we pay for it? Why should it be free? Nothing is free in life, right? I just described an eco-service payment. Ecosystem service payment. If you want cleaner water, you promote processes that will give you cleaner water. Water is not free. Now we know that in the West, but people back east don't know that. People in Washington don't know that. Water is not free, you gotta pay for it. So if you want water to be cleaned up, you can build a $10 billion cleaning factory to clean the water, or you can incentivize landowners to do better practices, put less nitrogen in the damn water, take more out by wetlands and other processes, but they can't do it for free. They can't afford to do it unless we incentivize them economically. So that is an ecosystem services payment. So, the law of unintended consequences, the best example by far in my experience is the northern spotted owl. So the northern spotted owl lives in old growth forest in the Northwest. It lives primarily and nests primarily in old growth redwood and old growth Douglas fir, and environmentalists sued to get it listed, that it was declining in population, which was true, and that it would go extinct, which is doubtful, and that we needed to protect all of this land, all of this habitat for the northern spotted owl. It was actually a smokescreen. Those people who sued were tree huggers, and they hated the timber industry, and they wanted to put them out of business. That was really their motivation. The spotted owl was a bit of science that gave them some leverage to go to court. And they succeeded. One of the consequences was the court's rulings about habitat was vastly larger than the actual habitat of the northern spotted owl. It included all of the forests, not just the rainforest, not just the old growth, not just the redwoods, not just the Douglas firs, but all the forests virtually from the coast all the way east of the Cascades in Oregon and Washington. The consequence economically, without a bit of payment by the taxpayer or the federal government, as an absolute unconstitutional taking, was the destruction of all of the timber industry. Timber was not allowed to be cut because the spotted owl came first. $6 billion of private wealth was destroyed. People living in Dana Point and Huntington and San Francisco patting themselves on the back. Bambi environmentalists who had never seen a goddamn spotted owl were saying, look what good we did. And they never bothered to inquire that the counties where the employment was destroyed lost their entire tax bases and had to close their schools down. I went and gave a couple of lectures at Corvallis at their College of Forestry, about the only one left in the country. And it was on this kind of stuff. And I visited, they have 11,000 acres of old growth forest that they own, and their forest manager told me a lot of these stories before I gave my lectures. And at the reception after I gave my talks, a professor came up to me and he said, Ed, if it's true that the spotted owl has not recovered for the reasons that are now claimed, my entire career is a complete fraud. I was kind for once in my life because he was right. It was a complete fraud. So how did it go wrong? The entire science of counting things like birds doesn't work very well, right? Because science is really conservative. And so where do you think biologists spend most of their time? In the field or in their offices? Right, God, you're smart. Right, and of course, we know that Jane Goodall spent years and years and years sitting in the damn jungle watching chimpanzees before she figured it out. You can't go there for 2 weeks in the summer and actually figure out the ecology of a system. It's incredibly complicated. So their conclusions that they're publishing are not good, number one. Furthermore, if you can actually go on land and count widgets, then you've got some pretty good data. But you can't go on private lands because the Endangered Species Act scared private landowners so that in the 1980s, when I went up to those ranches and said, can I cross your properties, they didn't say, leave the gates the way you found them. Oh, hell no, they said, do you work for the government? I actually got a shotgun in my face one time before I talked my way out of it. I mean, these people were really scared. The unintended consequences of the Endangered Species Act, among others that I'm going to describe further about the spotted owl, is the 3 S's of Wyoming. Anybody know what the 3 S's are? Shoot, shovel, and shut up. People who love the wildlife on their land already, all of a sudden felt their property rights threatened, and they did the worst thing possible. They actually started killing the animals rather than be subject to the Endangered Species Act, the law of unintended negative consequences. So, the outcome of the spotted owl is really, my family is like a Woody Allen movie, so I'm subject to a lot of really screwy people. But this is worse than that. I mean, I'm not sure that this is even comedy. What biologists finally discovered was the spotted owl was not recovered. We had 35 years to study their numbers. The protection of the habitat now was excellent, and yet their numbers were still declining. And somebody finally discovered that they were being outcompeted by one of their cousins, an owl called the barred owl. Now, I need to explain a little bit, but you know, we're in the middle of the ice ages. Does everybody know that? 3 million years ago, North and South America got connected up, the Isthmus of Panama, and the equatorial ocean currents shut down. They couldn't flow through, and the currents became north and south, dumping all that moisture up in the Arctic, creating the ice ages. And the ice ages are governed by a cosmological cycle discovered by a Polish astronomer, Milankovitch. And they're 100,000-year cycles. There's a whole bunch of different stuff that goes into the cycle, but it's 100,000 years, 90,000 years of ice, really making the value of property really low in places like Scandinavia because your house is under 5,000 feet of ice. And 10,000 years of really nice warm periods. Guess when civilization really exploded for humans? 10,000 years ago. It's not a coincidence. And so we're in a warm period. And since there have been 28 cycles of ice ages before us, you might think there'd be another one, right? And in fact, in the 1970s, all the climate science was bitterly complaining that the federal government was not putting enough money into the coming ice age. I can send you some of those papers, they're hilarious, right? And now, the government's not putting enough money in because there's a catastrophe called warming. And in my lectures, I argue that is warming worse than an ice age? But human beings, you know, if you don't like migration, do you want all those Norwegians living in North Africa? Is it better? My friends, my Norwegian friends voted for the damn Kyoto Accord. Are they out of their freaking minds? You know, they're now able to grow tomatoes. You know, they didn't used to be able to grow anything. And 10,000 years ago, they were under 5,000 feet of ice. You know, and it happens really fast, by the way. The old argument was, oh, you're a geologist, it happens under, you know, millions of years. Baloney. Ice ages come and go in hundreds of years. The little ice age, 5,000 feet of ice coming down the valleys of Alaska in 200 years. Don't think that this is just a very long thing that you can postpone. In fact, one of my positive aspects of climate change would be we may have averted an ice age. And they don't like to hear that. They just hate it. Why? Because it's a positive aspect of humans screwing up. And that happens all the time, right? We screw up and good things happen. We screw up and bad things happen, you know? And we have the capability of fixing it. So the barred owl expands its territory every time there's a warm period. And it is extending its range into the range of the northern spotted owl. It's bigger and tougher, and it outcompetes it for nesting space. and I'm not making this up, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, our brilliant federal agency, has just announced that in order to protect the northern spotted owl, they're going to start killing barred owls. Isn't this an innocent? Do we actually do that kind of stuff? Have we totally lost our perspective that one species is worth more than another species? They're stupid animals, you know? Leave them alone. If one outcompetes another, so be it. But no, they blame it on climate change, which may be a factor, but it's a small factor in this long-term history of expansions and contractions of the ranges of various animals and plants. So, the unintended negative consequences of suing people, over-regulating them, hating capitalism, has led us to a transformative period, which we're in now. And you may not be aware of it, but really things are getting better. Communities are now forcing the federal agencies to consider their communities in watersheds, in forests. For 20 years, I've been advocating public-private partnerships so that people who live in the forest have a say in how it's managed. You know, if you read the Forest Service literature, you know, all of our problems are the pine bark people. Don't be ridiculous, it's been around forever. No, we badly managed the forests, and we gave that particular pest an opportunity to vastly expand its populations, and it's causing us a lot of problems. The super fires that we see across the West are caused by bad forest management, and I have to tell you that I know foresters who tried to publish this 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago and got squashed by the federal agencies they were working for. They did not want the secret to come out. But the good news is that the pressure on them from the public is now causing public-private partnerships. The idea that people living in the forest are too stupid to manage their forest is another one of these arrogant things that comes down from government and academia. And us libertarians, I said it late, I said I'm a libertarian. I am a registered libertarian. I used it to keep it out of politics. Actually can work for us. So, libertarians, nature is important to us. We should love nature and we should want to live more cooperatively to it. But it's our job to take all of these ideas that are current, most of which are negative. This is what I do best. This is how my mind really is warped. And turn every one of these problems upside down into an opportunity. So finally, as a last thought on this kind of process, if you listen to environmentalists, industrial farming is evil. Those corporate farmers, they're really bad people, blah, blah, blah. It's a bunch of bullshit. Do the math. The biggest impact of humans on the earth is not CO2 in the atmosphere. It's not the warming of the ocean. It's the terraforming of human beings across the earth. That's the biggest impact. That we are farming and cutting down and destroying nature. And most of that is in subsistence farming. So you study subsistence farming. I worked in Africa for 15 years. The average subsistence farm in Africa, the yield of corn in their fields is 1/20th of an Iowa farm. 1/20th. So if you converted Zimbabwe's agriculture, which it had been before the gangsters destroyed it, into industrial farms, took all those people, moved them off into the city for better jobs, you could then revert all of that subsistence land back to wildlife. And you could have rhinos and elephants and safaris and lots of money from tourists in millions and millions of acres. So in fact, environmentalists who are arguing that we should have local food actually have it backwards. We really need industrial food. Because if we have industrial food, we have less land use. Smaller amounts of land for farming and much more land for recreation, for our souls, for the quality of life, for the interaction with nature. So I suggest that every one of these ideas that you find very negative, just turn it upside down and think about it not as a problem, but as a possible solution. Thank you. I'll open up to Q&A.
Questions?
Hey, don't turn around.
So, you mentioned a couple times people patting themselves on the back, like people. We humans have an incentive to show other humans that we're good people, right? So you talked about the signaling mechanism. Look how good I am. Is there a way that we can take that human necessity and use it to our advantage and say like, hey, I'm so good. Look at me. I'm against the tragedy of the commons. Is there a way that we can flip that? We can use that need for our advantage?
Absolutely. And in fact, it's another entire topic that I've been involved with for 20 years. And it's called collaborative conservation. So instead of laws and regulations and punishment, it's bringing stakeholders together. It's bringing communities of people together. You know, community was a dirty word for a while in the US because a community was a village in Africa. But actually, we have communities of stakeholders. And so when the greater sage grouse was under threat by a lawsuit, I put together a voluntary group to do so much stewardship on private lands and recover the sage grouse so it never had to be listed. And it was successful. So what did I do? I had a meeting that I brought together environmentalists, energy companies, NGOs, environmental groups, academia, government agencies into a room, a facilitated meeting, and guess what happens? The guy who was the enemy, and you're sitting next to him eating lunch, you discover that he plays golf just like you do, or he plays tennis, or he has grandchildren. You look him in the face and he's a human being. You can only demonize people when they're over the horizon. That's the them versus us mentality. Some of that's wired into us. We have to fight against that. We have to find the ways to actually validate people. And guys, people don't have to agree with you for you to validate them. But if you do treat them like human beings, you come up with mutual understanding instead of horrible antagonisms. And I did that. So this is a very long explanation to a short question. I apologize. I went to Africa, not as an arrogant, rich white guy to teach Africans what to do. I had witnessed the environmental movement, which was really bad laws that did huge damage economically and culturally, made enemies, and yet we had some successes. Why? Because we're rich. Because we're rich. So I figured if I went to really, really poor places that are doing some good work, I could learn how to do it cheaper. First rule of business, right? Find a way to do it cheaper. You make more money that way. And I did. There's private lands conservation. Why should we hunt elk in the West with a hunting permit that's $25 when this is the greatest trophy elk in the history of the world and some foreigner will pay $100,000 to hunt it? We are anti-capitalist in our animal management. We've got to change that. And you change that by working with private landowners and public-private partnerships. You chip away at it a little bit at a time, and it starts to gain momentum. When I started this 20 years ago, bottom-up projects, I got attacked by people from the Nature Conservancy and other big organizations, World Wildlife Fund. You gotta work with federal governments, you gotta make laws, otherwise it's not gonna work. And 3-4 years later, they started coming back and saying, wow, growing these projects locally actually works because they are the experiments on the ground. They're the ones that show other people how to do this better and better. Next. Thanks.
I had a question. It's a two-parter. One is, since the Ice Age has started, wasn't the interglacial periods or the warm periods about 140,000 years compared to 13,000 for about for the ice ages.
The opposite.
The opposite.
The average is, there have been 28 ice ages in 2.8 million years. So the average cycle, and it varies, by 20, 30%, is 80,000 to 100,000 years of ice and about 5 to 15,000 years of warm. And the other thing about it is, the way we've discovered how it really works is by coring Antarctica all the way down to the rocks. 500,000 years. That's 4 ice ages. It's not just the last one. And what we find is, it's not a lovely bell curve or sine curve. It goes like this. So if you've got 10 years of hockey stick increases in temperature, that's nothing. It doesn't inform you about the longer term trends. And the early models for climate change did not use the Milankovitch cycle at all. It's like you built a car, but you just left the internal combustion engine on the side because you didn't like it. Excuse me, but it's part of cars, right? And if you know how that works, then maybe you'll invent a more efficient system. But you just don't ignore it and leave it behind, not in science. The science of climate change is very distorted by politics right now. It's not that we're not changing climate, by the way. But on the other hand, to label anybody a climate denier is a way to demonize somebody who disagrees with the politics of climate change, and that is poison to science. I'm not opinionated, all right?
So I'm curious your thoughts. This isn't as much of a question, but I really enjoyed everything that you shared. I feel like I definitely learned something tonight. But there was one point where I was like, oh wait, no, that goes against something that I believe in. So I wanted to point that part out. To remain environmental with farming and cattle ranches and things like that, you're saying that industrial farms do good for the land because they're not taking up as much space. However, the nutritional value of those animals are then compromised by being in industrial settings. So eventually, yes, you're helping the environment perhaps by keeping the facilities smaller and not taking up as much land, but then all of a sudden you're compromising the quality of the animal's life and the nutritional value, things like that. So I'm kind of curious how you square that circle and put those two value systems together.
And the answer is, why are you buying those animals? Make your vote in the marketplace. I buy grass-fed beef directly from a rancher.
Exactly. But at the same time,
He's still an industrial rancher. He ranches 10,000 acres. But I go out of my way. I'm willing to pay a little more, right? If you think pigs are treated horribly, which they are in industrial pig farms, go and find a local operation. I can give you names of at least 3 of them, and buy your pig. If you like pork, buy your pigs locally, and that works. But they're still industrial farms, and they're still very, very high productivity, and that's the trick. Not that they should be 100,000 acres versus 50 acres, but that they should be extremely high productivity.
So let me just follow. So you're saying that when you're contrasting it to subsistence is like several dozen acres rather than something that we're buying from down the road. That's hundreds of acres still.
Well, subsistence, for instance, the worst experience of my life was working in Zimbabwe. I fell in love with that country. I fell in love with the African people, the wildlife, the countryside, the smell of the air. I was absolutely hooked. And that country was destroyed by gangsters. This was the 3rd largest agricultural exporter in the world, and now it can't feed itself. So, you libertarians, you get it right. Government destroyed this country. And the great conservation areas of wildlife were privately owned. 5 million acres were invaded by subsistence farmers. But it's a desert. It's the savannas of the low veld, as it's called, V-E-L-D-T, low veld. And they took these lands, they burned the trees, they planted maize, and I watched them for 10 years, and in 10 years they got one good crop. They got 2 partial crops. They got 2 partial crops of sorghum only, and they had 5 to 7 total failures. So, you know, agricultural science is really important. And you can't just say these are poor people and so you've got to give them more land. That's not the right approach. They need to have really good agriculture, and they had it in Zimbabwe.
I have a question. So you talked about the owls a little bit, and how the government was straight up killing owls to preserve another one. Can you talk, are there more instances where governments have essentially targeted animals? Like I believe they paid farmers to kill coyotes and wolves and bears and that sort of thing?
Yeah, there's actually a government agency in the Department of Agriculture, the Fish and Wildlife Department, that actually goes out and kills animals. They kill 3 or 4 or 5 million animals a year. Most of them are non-natives, like starlings, that destroy a lot of croplands, a lot of produce. So right now they're killing a lot of wild boars in Texas that carry disease, and I argue that they all should be turned into pork products. We shouldn't just bury them in a landfill. We should use them economically, as they do in Spain. The same damn animals are running around eating the acorns in Spain as they are in Texas. You know, why are we killing them by a federal agency instead of using them as a resource? The whole non-native species problem is really a huge amount of money spent very poorly. We haven't exterminated a single invasive species. You know, we spend a lot of money holding them down. We make a lot of deal about cheatgrass. I think it came from Russia. And yet, my ranchers that I work with, they feed their cattle on cheatgrass in the early spring. Cheatgrass dies off really early, so then you move them on to other grasses. So there are a lot of policies that we have that are not economically efficient, as I said, but they also still have some positive effect. It's just that we're rich and we can get away with spending money less than wisely.
Hey,
Like,
And I really liked your book, and I'd like you to talk about it a minute. This is Ed's book. I've read it. I love it. It's called Running with Rhinos, and this man actually did run with rhinos.
you know, looking at me, you wouldn't think that I was the kind of guy that would, when a friend says, let's jump off a cliff, I wouldn't say how far down it is. I'd say, when are we going to do this? So I'm an adventurer, and I've always been, from the earliest age, catching snakes when I was a kid, you know, pretty fearless. So I went to Africa working in conservation, and my first meeting with World Wildlife Fund in Harare, Zimbabwe, was a horribly boring facilitated meeting. And they have tea, just like our coffee break at 10 o'clock in the morning. And I'm a schmoozer, so I'm going around and introducing myself to these various scientists, and I hear a guy talking about rhinos. This is Raoul Dutoit. He ran the Rhino project. And I went right up to him and said, can I volunteer? And he said, no. And it's really dangerous. And by the way, he's a very smart guy. He pegged me as an American donor. And you know, the first rule of philanthropy is don't kill your donors. It's really bad for business. And so he said no. So naturally, I came up with a plan. I was going there twice a year, and I immediately made friends in Harare and threw enormous parties, bombers of beer, big barbecues, they call them braais in Southern Africa. And I would invite everybody, the embassy people, the World Health Organization, the Rhino guys. It was a smokescreen. I don't care about the Rhino guys. And the third party we threw, I drove 5 hours from a conservation site. And that's the most dangerous thing in Africa, driving on their damn roads. You know, I mean, the big lorries drive on the other side of the road and they run you over. I mean, it's really dangerous. So we get back and we throw an American 4th of July party. I had brought American flags. I hired fifes and drums, the little native kids, you know, to play for us. Big barbecue, bombers of beer. I made all of those people from the British Empire march around with American flags, singing Yankee Doodle Dandy and down with the British. Down with the British. It was wonderful. Got them all drunk. Went back down to work. 5 days later, get a shortwave radio call. This is a place where there's no cell phones. There's no hardwire, anything. There's almost no electricity. And it was this guy, Raul, who flies his own 2-seat airplane as the spotter plane for this project, calling this friend of mine saying, would Ed like to volunteer? We're translocating 2 white rhino bulls. And we were there. And his second in command, Natasha, 6 foot tall, gorgeous blonde Australian, looks like a young Sigourney Weaver. I go up to her. I expect to pull on a rope or carry some gear. I'm completely incompetent. I had no skills at all, right? And Natasha says, Ed, you're flying spotter behind Raul in the little airplane. And I go, no, no, no. And my problem is that I'm a trained geologist. A big old rhino sitting under a tree is going to look like a rock. I won't recognize him. And they shoved me into this little coffin box behind the pilot, and off we went. And I was so excited that within 5 minutes, I spotted the first rhino before the pilot, who's got 25 years of training. And after that, I became their American volunteer. I smuggled all kinds of scientific equipment into Africa. I would show up in Harare or Lusaka or Arusha, dressed in American safari clothes with a camera around my neck, a terrible old hat on my head, loud American voice, talking to anybody who would listen to me, and all the time I'm looking at the customs guys so that when their backs were turned, I would go straight through no declare.
Thank you for your service. That's awesome.
About $200,000 of computers, GPS units, cameras, aircraft parts, you name it, I smuggled in over a 15-year period. I was really good at it. I also had some acting training, so I really enjoyed doing this. I also raised all the guns to arm our scouts when the poaching got bad for rhinos. I bought AR-15s for about 100 scouts. Raised all the money here in the U.S. So in my CV, I have smuggler and gun runner. and so I also do a lot of things just, when somebody says, why do you do that? My answer is always because I can. Nobody's ever stopped me from doing anything in my life. Leif and I had very dear mutual friends who ran the Bloomsbury Review, right? The Our Family. And so I started writing book reviews. I mean, why not? I have all the talent in the world, right? I don't know how to do it, but I'm going to try, right? And the editors actually trained me to write. I wrote on geology and I wrote on Africa, right? So I wrote book reviews, and I'm reading this book that really pissed me off. This really, really rich guy with a really old-fashioned environmental kind of attitudes. People are the bad players and the animals are the good players. Wrote this book, and I couldn't review it. It pissed me off so much, so I said, screw this, I'll just write my own book. And so I wrote about my 15 years of chasing rhinos around. They're sedated rhinos, by the way. And a sedated black rhino, before it falls down, can kill you as fast as a moving car. So they're really, really dangerous. And it was great fun. Did a lot of running through the bush, flying in helicopters. I became the second spotter, so when the regular spotter wasn't there, because what they discovered was, I don't get airsick. I don't need water. I can be in the plane for 12 hours and drink a half a liter of water the whole time. That way they don't have to land for me to go to the bathroom. It's really, it was really absolutely an incredible adventure.
Last question.
Thanks, Lee.
What was the reason they left the village? Changed the conservation?
There were 2 reasons. My last project, I was an owner and the chief scientist, and what I discovered was a radical new model for geology, and I got to publish it. So I did the best science of my career, and I got published. Everybody knew that I did this crazy-ass work. And secondly, I owned an interest in the 3rd largest gas field in the history of the U.S. And so I went home 1998. Before I had ever seen a penny. I mean, it was all money out. My income was less than my expenses for 6 years. It was a very scary time. And Yes, Western Wyoming, Pinedale and Jonah Field. I'm the guy who found Jonah Field. Sitting out there in south of Pinedale, in the middle of nowhere, with absolutely no indications of any kind of commercial gas. And there's now 2,600 wells in that field. And in fact, recently, you may not know this, but the NAACP publishes articles online, and they're very, very anti-capitalist. For instance, black people live around oil refineries that poison them. Those evil, evil refineries, which, if anybody knew it, have been cleaned up tremendously over the last 40 years. Tremendous amount of money to clean them up. Why do black people live around the refineries? Because it's the cheapest land and cheapest housing around. That's why they live there. You know, that's why other people who were poor, those people who were poor are now people who are middle class or maybe upper class, and they don't live there anymore. So it's good housing and it's cheap housing. But they write this stuff. And a few months back, I got an email from Colorado State. They keep track of this stuff. They must have algorithms to pull their name out of articles or their names of, I don't know who. Anyhow, the NAACP demonized me, and they labeled me the father, the inventor of fracking. Now, I'm a geologist. Fracking is an engineering process. And it started to get developed when I was about 5 years old. It's been around for a very long time. And so CSU, I mean, they libeled me in a number of different ways. And my decision was to let sleeping dogs lie. I mean, fighting this just gives them better advertising. What does it do for me? I don't have to defend myself. But my friends went out and they bought me the domains, fatherofracking.net. Well, thanks, guys. This is great. One more question? So your hand was up.
Yeah, I wanted to know what your solution was to rhino poaching.
That's a really tough one. I got all these stupid little sayings. Like my saying about life, my old oil and gas partner John owns 2 jets and a helicopter, and I own 2 mountain bikes and a kayak. You know, material things don't make life happy. I do not need a private jet to fly me around. In fact, unless I'm flying overseas, I fly commercial economy. I just really, in fact, I meet lots of interesting people. Well, of course, I talk to them. They never get to do a bit of work, you know, on an airplane if they're sitting next to me. And so, it's, God, I forgot what question all Rhino. So my stupid little saying about conservation is, if you make the animals more valuable to the local people alive than dead, they're not going to eat them. They're not going to poach them. You have to create economic value for the local people, not the gangster governments, not the government agencies, the local people who are being affected. If an elephant crosses the national park boundary and eats your maize, your kids might starve. There's no safety net in those countries like there is here, right? So if you have a game management area and you get to hunt 2 elephants, your village gets to bring in trophy hunters at $100,000 a hunt, you got enough money not to go out and poach the damn elephant. You can say, kiss the elephant goodbye and buy your own maize and stay alive. So economics really can drive conservation in tremendous ways. Rhinos are a problem because rhino horn is $65,000 a kilo. So you can't make the rhino more valuable alive than dead. So what do? And I've written an entire article. There's an online environmental news site that I write for, and they refuse to publish it. And what's the reason? Rhino horn is a renewable, sustainable product. If you cut the rhino horn off without hurting the growing area of the rhino horn, it grows back. And you can sell it. So why don't you have a legal market in rhino horn, sell it directly to the Chinese, mark 50% of the money goes back into conservation, People, the biggest rhino owners right now are private landowners in South Africa. They have more rhinos than all the governments on earth. And so why not incentivize them with the marketplace? And the arguments are stupid, frankly. One of the arguments is you can't reduce the demand because 90% of the rhino horn in Chinese medicine is actually water buffalo horn. And my point is, screw the demand. You know, the demand has to be reduced by education. We didn't stop shooting animals like the bisons and the passenger pigeon because we ran out of them. We really re-educated ourselves to a different attitude towards nature and manage them better. The Chinese can do the same damn thing. They can make these changes, but it's going to happen in the elementary schools. It's not going to happen at the top of government. You have to change society to have a cultural difference, and that's going to take decades. So in the meantime, you protect the hell out of them on private lands more than on public lands, and you make them worth their while. The guys who have rhinos can't hunt them. PETA has seen to that. You know, PETA, that group that has ethics in their name, you know, people for the ethical treatment of animals, the most unethical environmental group I've ever come across. They are a real evil institution. They actually would threaten the lives of human beings to protect animals. Ethics? That's a really interesting policy for an environmental group. So yeah, so rhinos are difficult, and right now we're not solving that problem. But there are some good things going on. There's a private foundation that is taking over the management of national parks in Africa and building them back up again using economics. So you get rid of all the bribery. You know who the biggest poachers are in a lot of African national parks? The park rangers. I've actually interviewed park wardens and said, do your rangers actually, kill, antelope? Oh, of course. What else do they have to eat? I've got that recorded, by the way. So get rid of the politics, right? And then, so public parks are being really managed more like private lands, And they get to move animals around. You've got too many elephants here, you can move it to a place where you don't have elephants. And you can build populations by growing your landscape. So there's a couple of things that are going on that are working pretty well. But protecting rhinos is a problem. Kruger National Park is a war zone. I've been there. I actually flew in an attack helicopter. It is scarier than hell. You don't want people with guns, on the ground beneath you when you're flying in a helicopter. It's not like the movies. one bullet, into the engine of a helicopter, and you're gonna die. So yeah, it's really, really a serious problem.
Give it up, Fred.
That's it. We'll see you guys all back 3 weeks, not to December 11th.